would love to hear from you about the role of memoir in shaping collective understanding of equity and sharing our histories. I know that's huge. Many dissertations have probably been published on this, but we have a few minutes.
It is a very big question. The first thing I'll say is that there has been a big memoir boom, right? So people love reading memoirs. And they've loved them for quite a while. And I think what people love about them is that it allows them to step into people's lives, right? And to hear that I voice and to learn something along the way. The other really interesting thing I think about memoir is that now that there's been this boom is there's now an opening out of memoir forms. So it doesn't have to be this hero's journey where overcome adversity and succeed, the end, we're all happy ever after. There's far more complicated ways and more complex ways of telling stories that acknowledge that there isn't just one sort of narrative arc, shall we say. There are different forms that hold to different storytelling traditions, for example. So we have people like Michelle Porter, Red River Métis, who talks very much about in her own about her own writing, that she's writing in a Métis way, right? She's using Métis storytelling as a way of telling her stories. And there's room for that in memoir these days. There's also been a push, finally, publishers have finally said, oh, wait, there are BIPOC writers. Wow, maybe we should do something about that. And so there was this push starting, I guess, 6-7 years ago, this own voices, really to say, okay, what happens when people tell their own stories in their own way, right? So memoir does allow for that, particularly as people are stretching and pulling at the boundaries of what constitutes a quote unquote story, right? So people have, and this is why I put quote unquote story in the sense that typically Western frames of reference have been held to what constitutes a proper story. And now there are there's much more variety in how people are telling their stories through memoir. So I think in that way, memoir can be super useful in terms of having people think about how is it that we've organized our society? Why is it that I haven't heard these voices before? Why haven't I heard this kind of storytelling before? How does this make me see the world differently? And how can I imagine the world differently? So those things are all super important. The downside potentially of memoir in terms of equity seeking is that sometimes people will get asked or will be assumed to be the spokespeople for everyone. So, oh, you're writing from the perspective of a Korean Canadian. What do Korean Canadians think of this? Well, memoir is about that particular person and that particular person's experience. And you cannot necessarily extrapolate entirely from that into saying everybody who has your background has this experience, because that's just not the case, right? So I think that there is a lot of sort of emancipatory, transformative potential in memoir and what it can do, what it can make possible. But there's also the sense that we have to also say, well, just because this person experienced it doesn't mean that everybody like that experienced it that way. They might have experienced it differently.
Yeah, thank you. That's really, really interesting. And actually something that I've seen in organizations sometimes, if there is a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, sometimes that unfortunately can also happen. There's a generalizing. Well,
Yes.
no, the folks that are racialized in our community don't want to do that. Well, that is one individual on your committee. And have you spoken to to your organization more broadly about this issue?
Well, yes. And also in relation to organizational things, what also sometimes can happen is, oh, you're the racialized person. You should be on our diversity and equity committee. So there's the assumption that therefore, if you're the quote unquote different one, then you must be on that committee. And absolutely, it's important to have diversity on your committees, but you can't this is quote unquote the diverse one. This is another diverse one.
Yeah.
And that can be a problem as well.
Yeah, on many levels.
Yes.
Amongst others, just the assumed extra labor, because this is often off the side of people's desks.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the lone power, how power works. So you have your whole group of people, and maybe everybody wants to be on that committee. I'm not going to say people don't want to be on the committee, but say you have a whole group of people who are generally experiencing marginalization in the workplace, and they're on that committee. Because they're experiencing marginalization in the workplace, are they really going to have the ear of the people in power?
Mhm.
So they can just be speaking to the wall over and over again, even though they all want change, and even though, say, the powers that be say they want change.
Mhm.
So I think sadly, you need to have the voices with power within those committees too, because otherwise that change won't happen.
Mhm.
It's a very complicated and messy and ugly thing because it can just ultimately perpetuate things as well.
Mhm. Yes, the existence of the committee does not
Does not
fix everything.
no, sadly it doesn't. You'd think it could,
Yes.
but there's a lot of, saying you want change without actually really wanting to do the work to make the change happen.
Mhm. So true. So true. Um, and so I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about this quilt as it relates to identity. I, or is that too
No,
strong
it is actually
entry into?
it is an important thing because so I started playing with quilts, I guess about 10 years ago. And then when I went to Suriname to do my research, I was staying in a little apartment, but I would meet with my aunt and uncle every day. And one of the things I noted when I was walking in Suriname was it was the first place where everybody looked like variations of me and my family. The first place I'd ever been where everybody, well, I looked down the street and I was like, oh, there's my aunt walking by. There's my aunt walking again. There's my uncle walking by. I finally was like, wow, everybody sort of looks like my family here. It's really interesting. And so one of the things I wanted to somehow grapple with that and play with that. And so one of the things I did is I went looking in fabric stores and I wanted to get a sense of what happens when people's meet, right? Because Suriname is one of the most multiculturally diverse countries in the world, and partly because of histories of forced migrations, right? That it is the way it is because of that. And so it's a very people are butting up against each other all the time, but they're also intermixing and intermingling in very sort of rich and deep and complex ways. You have things happening in Suriname that the people in Canada, when they talk about multiculturalism, could only dream of. And so I wanted to get a sense of that jostling of cultures. So I went to a fabric store and I chose fabrics that spoke to some of those histories. So there are some plaids on this quilt, and there's a plaid here, there's a plaid here, and those are maroon plaids. So the maroon communities that had escaped slavery and then developed their own communities deep in the rainforest, and they are still maintaining these communities today. So those are maroon plaids. I also chose some African wax print fabrics, and that's, for example, here is one of those. Um, there might be some others. I can't see them very easily right now. I also chose some Javanese fabrics because there was also a history of indentured laborers coming from Java, and so there are Javanese fabrics here, and then Indonesian batik, which is slightly different because there were also Indonesian laborers. And so I chose a whole range of fabrics. There's also some fabric in here which I can't say I'm probably sitting on it. When I first went, there was an anniversary of the independence of Suriname. That was in 2015, and Suriname became independent in 1975. And so there was fabric about that. And so I thought, what happens if I put all of those together into a single quilt? Because that'll show that jostling. That'll show all these things come together. You see all the individual pieces if you want, but actually what you see is this big, colorful sort of jumble.
Mm.
And that's what I wanted, was a colorful jumble that for me was a way of trying to figure out how it is that I fit into that big colorful jumble, right? So it is my first full size quilt I ever made. I broke every single quilting rule in the book I discovered afterwards. I didn't follow any rules. I was just doing stuff. It is wonky as all get out. If you looked at it closely, you'd be like, oh my God, what's going on here? Because it is not sort of the work of an expert quilter, but it is the work of art, right? And so that's why I did it. This is what I was trying to work through, and it's always been important for me for those reasons.
Mhm. And it remains central in your life, even though you've quilted so many things since then.
It is something that it's on our bed, in our room. As I was mentioning to you before, I said, it is something when people who come in to do, various things in the house. And they always think it's the girls' room. I don't know why they think it's the girls' room. I don't know where they think we sleep, because it's the only double bed in the house. But they think it's the girls' room. Maybe because it's all the colors. Maybe because it's chaos and patterns. I don't know. I have no idea. But it is definitely, I love it. It's there all the time. And fortunately, my husband loves it too.
That is lucky. Yeah, beautiful. There's a whole gender episode that could be said on why, why people might assume it's the girls'
It's true.
room.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think my husband likes it. I was thinking about gender. I think he likes it because he's actually colorblind and it's got bright colors and he can see bright colors, but he can't see dull colors. So he hates things like beige. But
Oh, wow.
this he can see.
This reminds me of Jack Sprat. Jack Sprat could eat,
Yeah.
his wife could eat no lean. You love color.
I am, the word maximalism was made for me. Yes.
Which is why you're perfect in quilting. So I'm curious. Is a big question. Another dissertation question in a few minutes. How do you think the form of narrative can help sort of shift or shake up or help dismantle the systemic bias?
But this could go back to our earlier point around storytelling traditions, right? So if you read in different forms, then you read and you understand the world differently, right? So different storytelling traditions, it's like speaking a different language. A language carries culture, and the way one frames a story carries culture as well. And so if you always read a conventional Western narrative, then you start to see the world through that conventional Western narrative. Right? I think of this as an odd comparison to make, but there was a little online game where you could mix together. It was called Bitter Remixer, and you could mix together Lego ads for a full quote unquote boy Lego, girl Lego, but you could swap the text, and so you could have images for the boy Lego, the voice for the girl Lego, and vice versa. What it showed was that how it was all 30-second things, but the narrative was exactly the same for both of them. And the peak exactly the same time. It's hilarious because, of course, what's for the girl go down and they go sit at the coffee shop and you see it happening in the background, and vice versa. But what it showed was just how tight and how conventional that narrative was and how everybody is programmed to see a story in a very specific way. If you are then reading stories that are told from different traditions, from different perspectives, you start to see the world differently. You start to understand the world differently. You start to think about the world differently. You start to think about relationships differently. And so brings me back to Michelle Fortin's point around writing in a crooked Métis way, what she calls a crooked Métis way. You see it also, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, she talks about the danger of a single story. There's a danger of a single storytelling tradition,
Yes.
right? And what do you not see when you're only exposed to a single story and a single way of telling a story? That's what I would have to say.
Beautiful. It reminds me when you're talking about the convention, right? I've had moments as a mother, and our son is still young, where I think, wow, he doesn't know the traditional, Snow White. He doesn't know Jack and the Beanstalk. And wondering, did I leave something out? And then I realized, no, because he knows other stories, and so he will have different references, and that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think to myself, I think back to childhood. We immigrated to Canada when I was 5, and so I had my childhood was in Alberta. And as far as I was concerned, being Canadian meant being Ukrainian Canadian because I was surrounded by Ukrainian Canadians. So to me, being Canadian was borscht, pierogies, cabbage rolls. Like that's being Canadian because that's what I saw around me, and that's the world that I inhabited. As obviously, the surrounding Cape Valley is often integrated in the late 19th, early 20th century, but that was to me, that was it.